We've heard this from many of you. Your students are doing well reading single syllable words, but now they're moving to more difficult texts with multisyllabic words, and they're getting stuck, especially when the patterns aren't predictable.
If that sounds familiar, you are going to love this episode. Researcher and professor Devin Kearns is here to break down what the research really says about teaching students to read longer words and how to help your students tackle them.
Hi, Devin. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. So excited to be with you.
Yeah, we've been waiting for a long time to have you on, so thank you for being here.
That is true. That is true. All right, so we're going to jump right in with some tough questions for you, but we really wanted to think about, we always hear that students around like third grade, it's always third grade, that students move from single syllable words and reading those to reading these multisyllabic words. And sometimes they like hit this wall. And so we want to hear from you. Like, you're an expert on reading multisyllabic words or polysyllabic words. So why is it that students often hit this wall?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking tough questions. Really appreciate that. No, it's great. Yeah, so why do they hit this wall? Well, a lot changes about the long words. One thing that changes is that they are almost all polysyllabic words have a schwa sound, right? So that's not true for like compound words, but most words in English are complex. They have more than one morpheme, and in any word that has more than one syllable, you're going to have a schwa sound, so like an about, right? It's not about, it's not about, it's about. And that's something we have to do on every single word. So if you aren't sure what to do, then with these schwa sounds, you don't really recognize that that's important. It becomes really challenging.
And we've just taught students all the short vowel sounds, long vowel sounds, and then we're throwing this whole other sound in there.
Right, exactly. And this thing happens where the single letter vowels like A and razor now have a long sound. And that's not something that they learned before typically, right? So now you have to deal with the fact that like these single letter vowels have multiple pronunciations. And that combination of factors makes reading these long words really challenging. And after first grade, the number of words with more than one syllable increases really dramatically through middle school. It's a problem that happens because the words get harder and get longer, and students have to deal with those.
I think I heard you say the majority of words in texts are multisyllabic, like once we get past those early grade levels. Is that right?
After first grade, more than 50% of the new words we encounter have more than one syllable. So it's a lot.
It's, really important.
Yep.
And I imagine there's just a lot of opportunity for things to go wrong as you're sounding out those multisyllabic words, because there's lots of different parts of them that could have different sounds. And so as you're trying to put it together, you really have to have some sort of idea of what the word is in your brain, right? You've had to have heard the word before so you can put it together. And then that brings in a whole bunch of other things that we could talk about probably for hours, right? In terms of knowing the words and having some sort of knowledge of those words.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of the key idea, is that like we're always looking for like a reference in our, the term I always found really challenging, our mental lexicon, right? Our personal dictionary of words. So one of the things that people do when they're reading a word is they're scanning their brain as they're pronouncing it to see like, is there a word in my mental dictionary that works this way or that's similar to this? And this is really important when you get to a word like about, and you say about, you search your kind of mental lexicon, your personal dictionary, and say, do I know a word like this? And you're like, one that's really close is about, right? And so we make that adjustment because it's a slightly different pronunciation, but it's close enough that when we have those skills of reading long words, it actually isn't that difficult for you. And that's also why phonological awareness is really essential, because with phonological awareness, what we're doing is that allows us to make the wrong thing into the right thing, right? And the examples I like to give are things like the word cotton, right? So if you say the syllables in cotton, ton, like the t sound is not in the word cotton. The d sound is in the word cotton. It's a glottal stop, right? It's this other really random like little sound. And so you need to make this mental manipulation to turn, the t sounds into that. And that's what, some readers find really easy and other readers find really
Okay, you're saying something, Devin, that when I was teaching second grade, and at the end, when you're starting to get into those multisyllabic words or polysyllabic words in second grade or at the end of the year, I would have a word like that, and I would not want to be teaching it wrong, right? So there'd be a word like cotton, and I'm like, I don't know where to. Even if I could take a good guess about where to break it syllable wise, I still wasn't quite sure how to say it because it didn't have those sounds. And so it was always really tricky as a teacher to try to figure this out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I even give the example of like the word fan, right? Like there's a time when I started to worry, like, should I even teach a word like fan? Because doesn't make fan. Like fan has a nasalized vowel, right? The ass is actually, sorry, it sounds bad. But and so that sound of the A has been shifted, right? Because it's next to a nasal sound, like the N sound. And so I, for a time, was like, maybe I shouldn't teach these words for the same reason. I was like worried that I was like almost doing harm by being like, it's cotton, we have to turn it into cotton. And then what I realized later was actually that's exactly what I need kids to learn. That's exactly what I need to teach them because they need to do this mental manipulation, right? There's always going to be this need to change the wrong thing into the right thing. And that's how we have to do it because we're trying to find that entry in our mental dictionary. And this is what we do when we sort of encounter something like cotton. We've got to get kids to do that. And that's going to happen through a lot of practice.
That's really helpful. It actually feels great as a teacher to know that that's what we want them to do. We want them to see it, have a recognition, and then be like, oh, cotton is not a word that I'm familiar. Oh, it's cotton. Oh, okay. Now that sound can be whatever. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about, something that I think might be considered controversial. We've heard you talk about it before, but I think it's really important because it's something I've always been a little bit skeptical about. When I was in Baltimore City, we had to get trained for a program that had students identify syllable division rules, right? So closed syllables, open syllables, and they had to like mark up these words a whole lot. And again, maybe I'm like sounding very type A on this podcast today, but I was very nervous that I was going to teach them incorrectly because I had not learned these rules. So it was all new to me. I was learning them. And they were requiring the position that I was in the city to become a trainer. So I'm like, oh my God, now not only do I have to teach students and like teach these lessons and practice, but I also have to teach teachers. But the thing that I struggled with was I wasn't sure if these division rules were actually helpful for students to be able to read. It felt like a lot of mental load, like cognitive load to be able to do all this stuff to the word rather than just like actually attack it and read it. But I know like you've shared that in the research that you've done, the rules aren't consistent and there are a lot of exceptions. And so I think that also added to, the apprehension that I was feeling. So I'm wondering if you can share about what your research found about like the consistency or inconsistency of the syllable division rules.
Yeah, definitely. So the study that I did was actually an analysis of words, not of kids. And so what I did was to look at like over 10,000 English words that were common in grades 1 through 5. And I found words that had either the VCCV pattern or the VCV pattern. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about, I mean, so, everyone here is a literacy person, but I'll just say it for people who are less literacy, is familiar,
Much
maybe don't know
appreciated.
about these. So anyway, so the VCCV means vowel, consonant, vowel, a word like rabbit, A-B-B-I. And a vowel, consonant, vowel word is a word like tiger, I-G-E. And you can also have VV like lion, IO, right? So, but let's not focus on that one for now. We'll focus on the other ones. Yeah. So, and like you, like being really like wanting to do it the right way. And also like when someone explained to me that there's a pattern here, I was like super excited because like I didn't think there was a pattern, right? So someone explained to me when you have a VCV pattern, if you break the word into parts and you end the first vowel or the first syllable with a vowel, that vowel says the long sound, right? It says I. And so then students can know that's tie and then gur, and you can put it together and make tiger. And I was like so excited because I felt like before that, I didn't have like a way to give kids access to that kind of thing. And so I felt like this immediate sort of like excitement about it. But like you, I was worried that I started to like wonder like, does this work all the time? Because you think about words like, linen or something and dragon, and it's like those don't work, right? Like you got the VCV pattern, but in linen, that I says the short sound, and dragon, the A says the short sound. I started to wonder, like, how good is this? And so when I did the analysis, basically what I found is that for two-syllable words, right, just words of two syllables, just often when we teach kids with these, it works about half the time with E. So in other words, half the words that have the E sound have the long sound when they have the VCV pattern, and half the words have the short sound when they have the VCV pattern, right? And that's not accounting for the schwa sound, which for E is actually the majority. Okay, so we're just talking about the long and the short, forgetting about that. And so for the other vowels, it's better. Like A is pretty good, and I is pretty good. O is very good. O is the best one. And then, U and Y are okay. And so, but they're not very frequent. And so basically what I concluded is, and so that was two syllable words, right? When you get past that, it's really bad, right? So these are things that are like working like less than a third of the time, because when you account for the schwa sound, because there are so many of those. And that made me think, if we're going to teach kids something about how to break words into parts, maybe this is not exactly the best use of time for the reason you also said, which is there's a lot of cognitive effort that goes into pronouncing, like, doing this work, right? Because we will teach kids, like, this pattern is VCV. You divide it after the V. You need a way to remember that. So you mark it up. You mark the V's, you draw the line. And then we teach kids like the macron, right? The little line across the top that says it's a long sound, or the bread, which looks like the smiley face. And, and you teach kids like those, you might not say the names, but you teach them that like those are associated with those sounds so kids will remember it. So that, so I just started to realize, like, in addition to the fact that these aren't that consistent, that's a lot of, yes, cognitive load for kids. And that's even when they're just reading one word. What do you do when you're like in print, right? It's hard to be like, let me stop, let me go over here on a little worksheet and like write it out and then come back, right? And you could do that, but that's not necessarily going to get you where you need to go. Or at least that is the theory. I will say that the VCCV rule is much more consistent. So, and that one does work a little better, even for longer words. We don't have as many of those with longer words, right? We start to get rid of those doubles a lot of times in the longer words. But when you have that, you can rely on that first one, usually say the short sound or the schwa sound. But it does say the short sound a lot. But, a lot of, what we would teach kids is we're teaching them the VCV because we need them to realize when that single letter vowel makes the long sound, because that's not what they expect.
So interesting. And you made me think when you were talking about the VCV specifically, what, like, if it works, majority of the time for a lot of the vowels, but not so much for E, but for a lot of them, it kind of works. But then when you get past the two-syllable words, it's almost like it works for them for a little bit when they are just moving up from one syllable to two-syllable, but then it kind of probably all just falls apart after that.
It falls apart, right? Yeah, and I think that's the tricky thing about it, right? Is like, so if you have this sort of space where they don't work that well, and, for the longer words, and there's this massive cognitive load, like you start to worry, like, what are we doing to the kids? I started to worry, this is like heresy to say this, but like, I started to worry it's as bad as like the guessing strategy in terms of time. Right. So like with when I didn't know about how to teach reading, like I'd have kids like for 25 seconds try to figure it out and use their strategies. Right. And like the kids would sometimes be silent because they don't know what to do. And so, and they're trying to work through this like list of 9 strategies or whatever, if they're using, the little animals kind of strategies or whatever. Right. And so they, they're in that same kind of cognitive space of like, taking themselves entirely out of the word, doing something that's like this extra cognitive exercise, and then coming back to the word. And that's the worry we all had about like the context-based strategies and the guessing, and using these strategies, was that we were not focusing enough on actual reading. We're taking them out of that. And I worried a little bit, this is going to be a problem here too.
Yeah. And there's so much like energy that goes into breaking it all apart, or I don't even know what to call it, like dividing the syllables and thinking about the rules and then doing all the things, that by the time you actually get to the part where you sound out the word, I feel like you've done so much at that point that I wonder about the efficacy of using those strategies to do that. And that's where, I kind of broke down. So I appreciate you explaining like, that there are, some hesitancies around that for good reason with the words. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes me think too that when we did a paper on this for the Reading Lead Journal, my colleagues and I, we were looking at, even for the CCV rule, there were like one of these programs has like 6 backup strategies, because sometimes you have like a CK, right? You have like, it's like, well, now you can't divide it between the C and the K because that's a digraph. And they had all these kind of like backup things. So it's like you have that cognitive load on top of everything else. And it feels like a lot, and maybe it's not a good use of time. So all that, like, this is the worst thing that I have to talk about, or I talk about, because like people hate when I say that so much. And, and so if you don't mind, I want to say a couple of things about that for
Sure.
people who are like
Please do.
already like, this is the worst podcast episode.
No, I mean, I think it's important to talk about it, and also then kind of be like, hey, like, we are talking about this because it's important, right? Because research is kind of showing it. So I appreciate you extending your thoughts here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. Well, I appreciate that you appreciate it. So I think then, but there are programs that include syllable division that have evidence of efficacy, meaning that if you look at studies of those programs, they have positive effects. And I'm certain that many teachers have used those strategies with kids, and kids have profited from those strategies, and it has helped their literacy, right? I have no doubt that that's true, because it's something that does work sometimes. But what I also say is that there are other programs that don't do that also have positive evidence, right? And so the question I always ask is like, if you did sort of a different type of strategy, or it taught about syllables in a different way, because I'm not saying don't teach about syllables. Let's be really clear. I am not saying we should just guess. But if I taught this in a different way, could I get at least the same results, or maybe better ones, right? So it's not about saying that this is terrible. That's not my endeavor here, is to say that like we shouldn't do anything or anything like that. I believe in evidence, and and when we think about actual studies of student behavior, student performance, what we find is that programs that use them have positive effects, and programs that don't have positive effects, right? And so it's not possible to say this is a totally bad idea, but it's not supported by the idea that when you look at words kids are going to encounter, that it's going to work. And then there's this cognitive overhead piece. And there's never been a study that showed that like specifically doing syllable division has like really positive effects compared to using a different strategy.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that. That's exactly what I was going to ask you next, because that programs have syllable types and syllable division, but also, I mean, standards do, curriculum evaluation tools do, right? It is really embedded within our literacy world. And so it would be really tough for people to hear you say, stop teaching syllables altogether.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So that's not what I'm saying. I want to be very clear that I already said syllables are the polysyllabic words or multisyllabic words. I really don't care which ones we say. So whatever makes you guys more comfortable, just say it. I do think that, I totally lost my train of thought. So you're going to need to edit this.
That's fine.
We'll cut it here.
What were we talking about?
Editor Brett, just give it a little snip snap.
Editor Brett, Devin messed up. So we're just talking about the
basically the mismatch between the tools, and then we were saying like we're not saying
don't teach
them. We're saying like teach them. I think we're heading into like maybe a what to do in terms of teaching them.
Yeah. I'm not saying don't do anything. Okay. Yeah. All right. So we'll get back to that. Yeah. So when we're talking about reading the polysyllabic or multisyllabic words, I want to be really clear that you can use good strategies for doing that. And there are a couple of things that are effective that acknowledge the importance of patterns inside syllables. That, for example, it's true that a single letter vowel will make the long sound or the short sound, and sometimes the schwa, but it's useful to teach students about that idea because they'll encounter a lot of words like that. The majority of words have one of those two sounds, right? And so it is really important to teach something about that. It's just that question, like, how much do we teach about the actual division of the word using these particular rules? And so, I'm not saying don't teach anything about syllables. It's also true that, it is in standards, because though a lot of those, came along at the time that I still used them and, taught them and, included them in programs, because, that was new to me and also seemed really logical. Like, I saw words for the first time, and there were, programs that had evidence effectiveness that, like people thought like we should put this into these standards, right? And so I acknowledge that, and I think it would be good if it were saying something about like a syllable based strategy and not necessarily like syllable division, but it is what it is.
And I wonder too if it's more like, you've got me thinking about this idea of just the language shifting slightly to like this idea of a rule, that when I say a rule, that makes me feel like it can't be broken, right? Like it's something that will always happen. So when you're talking about the long vowels and the short vowels and in the different syllables, like it's always the same, but it's not always the same. So maybe it's just a shift in, like, I think you use the word pattern, right? Like maybe it's less of a rule, more of a pattern, something that you see. And you refer to the English language as quasi-regular. Is that right? Is that the right word? I love that.
Yes. Yeah. Mark Seidenberg likes that word too. Yeah. So, right. I mean, that's the thing. So English has, one of our colleagues, Charles Perfetti, says like exemplary regularities is the term that he uses. Like a lot of things do work. Okay. But English does make it a little harder than other languages. Like, I don't know if other folks have talked about this on the podcast, but they've done studies to show like by the end of first grade, what percentage of words in a language kids in English versus other languages can read in Europe. Has anyone talked about that?
No, please do.
Okay. So they did this analysis. They took 13 European languages and they said what percentage of words in the language can the kids read? They're in the first grade level. So like Greek and Turkish are like the highest, like 93% or something of real words and about the same nonsense words. You want to guess where English was on the list of 13?
Oh my gosh.
At the bottom.
I'm going to say 30%.
Oh, so yes. So correct and correct, right. So
okay.
That was the last.
Well, you wanted me to guess I was thinking it was already 13.
Yeah, you're right. You already made the assumption. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So it was 30%.
30. Was it really?
Yeah.
I guess right. Wow.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? So
I promise I didn't Google it. Yeah. I promise. That's crazy.
It's crazy, right? So, so English does make it a little harder than other languages because for a lot of historical reasons, we borrowed spellings and all this kind of thing. So, that makes the work a little bit harder for students, but there are still these exemplary regularities in the system that we can help students use to, build their understanding when they don't have something to, hang their, sort of to get them started. And that's actually the reason that, like, if you're going to use syllable division, I get it in the sense that it gives you some hooks to hang on, right? So it's like, I've got something. It might give me the wrong answer. I might say Tigger or whatever. I might say Dragon or something, but it gives me something that I can use, because otherwise, particularly poor readers, like kids with reading difficulty, they don't know anything. So the only thing they know how to do is guess. And if you give them some tool, that tool might turn on the right thing. So that's why, I get the instinct to do syllable division. It's why I did it. And I did see kids improve because they did have some hooks, to help them. So I think, that's why it's, there is some value, but, again, the data don't always support the things that we like. And so we have to follow the research and do the things that are good.
Yeah. Okay. So we're on board. We're here with you in patterns over rules. Melissa and I are in. And I'm sure a lot of listeners are wondering too then, what should we do then to teach multisyllabic, polysyllabic words? And I'd love to give you a quick something to react to that happened in my own house in the last couple days.
Awesome. Can't wait.
Okay. So now this is semi embarrassing because I feel like she should know this word and I don't know what happened. But so I'll just say that this word came up and she said, Alexa told us that we had a notification. And I said, a notification. Okay. So that doesn't sound right to me. Does it sound right to you? She's like, no, not totally. I'm like, what part? She's like, the not part. I'm like, okay, so what in that part? She's like, I'm like, oh, okay, can you say it differently? And we finally got to notification very quickly. But first of all, I was stunned. I use that word all the time. Just in everyday life, we use that word now.
Yeah.
But when she said it, I kind of laughed. I thought she was kidding. But I mean, quickly we kind of like drilled down into the quote part that was, and I didn't think it was a particularly tricky part. So maybe we could talk through that, and then
Sure.
you could use that as like a springboard for some other strategies to do, because then I can put them in my toolbox for the next time something comes up.
Okay, fabulous. All right, so notification is a good one. It's hard because it's long, but we're gonna do it.
I figured you're in the poly multisyllabic
I
part
am.
here.
I know, I went all in on that. So like you get to do the hard words, right? So first, so the strategy that I recommend is a combination of like a morpheme strategy and a syllable strategy. So the morpheme part of it is where you find meaning parts in the words that are typically 2, 3, 4 letters, and you use that to get you started. And you find those affixes and you circle them. And one of my colleagues, Maureen Lovett, termed the strategy peeling off. So you peel those off of the base word, right? Or even if it's not a word, you take them off of what's left. And that's great because it reduces the size of the problem for a lot of students. And morphology, teaching kids about morphemes has awesome effects for both reading words and for understanding the meaning of words. It's really a great thing to do. So once you peel off the affix, then you're left with the rest of the deal. So notification, we've got the shun. Now, as you know, and I know, shun is not the actual morpheme. I-O-N, I want to be clear for listeners, I-O-N is the morpheme, but shun is the common way that we use it. The T, says sh or whatever, the TI says sh. So, so I get this, not exactly, but that pattern is so common. So you give kids these larger patterns like shun. We give the kid your daughter the shun, and now we have notifique. Right. This is the hard part is like, it's got a lot of pieces, right? So, but let's do it. Okay. So the next thing is now that we have that part off, we're going to break it into parts. And the way that we do that is we find the vowels and we mark them. So you can mark them and we can put a little check mark under them. Okay. And this is part of the learning strategy. Eventually you get rid of that. What that does is it tells you how many parts you're going to have because every syllable has at least one vowel, right? And that's a strategy developed by this researcher, Rolando O'Connor, where she basically studied this and found that this strategy was really effective. And the first thing you do is to find every syllable has at least one vowel, meaning that like A, those are two vowels, they go together. Even the vowel consonant E, two vowels in a syllable. So you find the parts that you're going to use, right? So in notification, notifique. So we're going to be 4 vowels that we're going to work with. And then we're going to figure out what each of the parts says, breaking it so that every part only has one vowel. Okay. So, and this is where like what we would do for syllable division might differ compared to what I'm going to suggest. So the next thing then is to figure out like, what do we do to break the word into parts? And this is where your daughter's, her mental way of doing this is a little bit different than the way that we want, we want kids to do, right? But I love that example because it's so great. So it's a great example of kids do all the time. So when you do this, we're going to break it into parts. And when I do this, I'm showing you a little card in my brain, like think of a little index card, and you're covering like the first part, right? And for listeners, I'm just holding up my hand in the air without a piece of paper. Anyway, so you set it up so that the index card covers part of the word so that the first part only has one vowel. And so there are 2 ways that could work. It could be NOT, right? Which is what your daughter was thinking, sort of in theory, right? And there's NO. So it could be either one of those, right? And this is the teaching part, not the part where she was just kind of figuring it out. But so for the teaching part, we say it could be either one. And at this point, we don't need to have a rule. So it doesn't actually matter in a way which one we use. It could be no, it could be not. What students do need to understand is that when you have a vowel at the end of a syllable, it says the long sound. If it's not at the end of the syllable, it's the beginning or middle, it says the short sound. That idea is essential. So that's where we talk about like open and closed syllables, right? That idea is really critical. I don't call them open and closed syllables. I typically call them long vowel syllables and short vowel syllables. This is like also heresy. People are like, it was like the worst thing ever. But what I realized is that like, well, open and closed doesn't mean anything to anybody, right? And then this is important. Do things like the syllable house. Do you guys know the syllable house?
I've seen it. I was going to ask you about it, so bring it up. Yes. Okay,
so the syllable house is this idea, like what you do is you make a little house, right? And what you do is you can put a word like hen in it, right? H-E-N, right? And you go H-E, and then there's a door, and the N is on the door, okay? So when the door is closed, okay, the N is at the end, the door is closed, okay? So the vowel can't go outside and say its name, okay? It's closed. The door is closed. It's closed in. When the door is closed, it says the short sound. So hen, door is closed, says the S sound, the short sound. Then you open the door because the N was on the door, and now the E is at the end of the syllable, okay? And now because the door is open, it says he, okay?
Okay, and that doesn't work all the time though.
It doesn't.
Okay.
But the thing about it is, it's not so much whether it works, it's that the only purpose of that is to get kids to remember that that pattern is called open or closed.
Open or closed.
That's what the door is for. Because the kids are trying to get kids to understand that, like, when it's open, it says the long sound. When it's closed, it says the short sound. So what that means is, like, the syllable house is like this one level removed from what we're trying to teach kids, which is like, there's a long sound, the short sound. But because teachers are like, well, I need kids to know what an open and closed syllable is, let me do this other thing to understand what open and closed syllables is. So now we're like 2 steps away from what we want kids to know, which is that, like, at the end, it says the long sound, in the middle, it says the short sound.
And it's asking them to remember another thing that they don't really necessarily need to remember.
Yeah, like the term open and closed is like, I mean, it has a linguistic base. Like there's a whole thing about the linguistics of that. But like, kids don't need to be linguists, right? So I started calling them long vowel syllables and short vowel syllables, which has its own challenges because, like, you could say, like, well, EA, like, is a long vowel, right? But I thought, well, it's a useful way to think of it. And so I just thought this is easier. And I don't have data on this except that, like, teachers tell me this works and have sent me emails saying, like, I had a student that this really helped them. So anyway, so we call them long vowel syllables and short vowel syllables. People call them open and closed syllables. I don't really have a quarrel with that as long as you don't teach the syllable house. Okay, so I don't think it's necessary, but just don't try to get the kids to remember that by doing a separate thing. So then once we have that idea, the vowels at the end says the long sound. In notification, if we cover it so that the T is covered, NO says no, and we know that because of vowels at the end, okay? And so that goes along with, it's very similar to the syllable division strategy in that we're breaking words into parts and we're using our knowledge that vowels in different locations make different sounds. The difference is we don't have a rule because this, a student could just as easily put the card after the T and say not, okay? And so that's where, like, you don't have to have a rule to do it. And this is actually great. Notification is a great example too, because you have no, okay? And then you have TIFF. Now, technically, because it has one F, it should be tie. It's not no tie, it's no to, or no to, it's actually a schwa. But notification, right? Some of them have the long sound, some of them have the short sound. So if you're going to divide up this really long word, which I would not for teaching purposes, probably, it's fine for our example, like, it's going to have places where the long sound is the right one and the short sound is the right one. But if we don't have a rule, if we just say we're going to break it so every syllable has one vowel, we can figure out what those vowels are and put it together. And the last piece is exactly what you very quickly held your daughter understand, which is like, you don't know a word that's like, that's not a word that you know. And that's really cool that she figured out, like, where it was. Like, what's a word like that you know? And she's like, oh, notification. Because, yeah, like you said, like, this is in the ether now. Like, we're getting notifications, like, all the time. So
every second of every day, right? I mean, yeah. I honestly, I feel like that's a good example because I was shocked to add all those other things into it. I was like, you have heard this word so often. I've said it. I guess she hadn't said it before, but we've said it. We've talked. It just felt like so crazy to me, as like a mom and a teacher, like, oh my gosh, this word that I've been using, we didn't know, like, maybe I need to do better.
You do not need to do better. I am certain that, like, she is getting the best literacy environment ever. No, but I think it's a really cool example because also she knew what it was, right?
Totally. Yeah. She could explain okay. So here's another thought. So after that, I said, so what other words are similar to it? Just to kind of throw something else out there. Cause
because you're a teacher.
When you're a teacher, you like to do that.
Yeah.
And she's like, oh, okay. So notebook, notorious, but she was giving me all those kinds of ones with the different And none of them held any, like, none of them were super similar to notification other than maybe like notify, right? Like, because I wrote down the ones that she gave me, but they did all have that O sound. So once she was able to identify, then we went on and, kind of.
That's funny, Lori, because I was wondering if she was almost kind of doing that peeling off that you mentioned, Devin, with the word not at the beginning, because she just saw this big word and she was like, well, I know not, right? Because now that you're saying that, I'm wondering if her brain stuck on, okay, what other words are N-O-T but say note?
Right. Well, I mean, we'll not know because we lost interest in that very quickly. I'm sure
you didn't.
I didn't. I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Pretty cool, though.
Yeah. So people might find this amusing for themselves. It's like, this happens all the time as adults because we read words in our brains. We don't read them out loud. And so you end up with like this like mental like representation of the pronunciation of a word and you know exactly what it means, but it turns out it's not, right? Okay. And so then you have this moment when you're like in like 10th grade and you like say it out loud and people are like, what are you saying? Do you guys know, do you have an example of this for yourself? Like the word that you said out loud and you like totally got it wrong because you didn't know.
Well, we always give our Hermione example.
Which is a name. It's a name, so it's different than a word.
We always say, we both said Hermione in our heads until we heard it out loud and we're like, what?
Yeah, it's perfect, right? So it's like, but you knew exactly who she was. You knew everything about her. You just like didn't know the right pronunciation. So
yeah,
it's
I feel like Devin, an example might be like I remember as maybe like a teenager or saying the word debris out loud, but saying debris.
Right.
Well,
why wouldn't you?
Who knows why?
No, because there's no reason for it not to be, right? Because you knew what it was, you'd read about it in some like textbook or whatever, and like it might as well be, right? It just isn't, right? And so, I think that's, that's still part of that same thing of like we need to figure it out. But I love that kind of thinking because it is true that the two things we do, so we said that the one thing you do is you're always looking for an entry in your mental dictionary to link the word to. But if it's an unknown word, you need to come up with a pronunciation for it, right? And you're going to use some combination of your strategies. And maybe, you just kind of, you bring it up however, and you end up thinking it's debris because, I mean, it might as well be, right? Because there's no reason for it not to be. And what's cool is you actually developed like a mental anchor for what that meant, right? It just, it's not what, people actually say in the real word, like, I thought like Yosemite, I thought Yosemite was the correct pronunciation. Like,
why not?
Right. You hear about Yosemite and then you read Yosemite. You don't realize they're even the same thing, right? It's like two different national parks.
Which is making me think so much about the power of teachers and why it's so important to develop that oral language, right? I mean, just like and also show the words as we're developing that language. Like, for example, debris or Yosemite, like just showing that word is going to make that connection for our students, or notification.
Yes.
Yeah. And we always think about the oral language in terms of meaning and vocabulary and, that's on the language comprehension side of things. But, to bring it over here into even when they're decoding the word, it can really help them if they've heard the word before.
Yeah. I actually recommend to that point that like teachers actually tell students like out loud the words that they're going to be practicing in the lesson so they hear them out loud, right? So especially if they're words that are less familiar to the kids, right? And I really want to be clear. If it's a really rare word, it's not really a word. It might as well be a nonsense word. I had a program I taught one time where they had hobnob on the list like, of real words. And they also had pipkin. And if you know what a pipkin is, I'll be really impressed.
I do because you used it in your article.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't even remember what it is still.
It's an earthenware cooking vessel, I think, from the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, don't teach the rare words, but if they're less familiar to students, there's nothing wrong with saying, listen to this word, say it out loud with me, because it's critical kids have the correct pronunciation of the words. And, a lot of students with reading difficulty, if you ask them to say the words, they won't even say them correctly. And so it's impossible actually to get the right answer if you think crocodile is pronounced dococrile. Right? So we need to get students to pronounce the words first when we're teaching a lesson. So I recommend that a lot of times if you're teaching words that might be less familiar to students, or just to confirm, like, it's crocodile. Let's all say it together. Crocodile. Say it slowly and so on. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk, you've talked a little bit about this. We've talked to other people on the podcast about set for variability. You didn't use those words, but you've kind of talked about it, which is that idea of the being flexible and trying out different pronunciations, especially with the vowels sounds. What does that, from your lens, what does that actually look like in a classroom? Like, what can a teacher do to help students with that?
Yeah. So the answer is I don't know. So so this is also what happens when you're like a science person. Is like a lot of times like I cannot tell you. I can tell you what I think, but I don't know if there's data on that, right? So yeah, there have been a couple of studies where people have taught students like a strategy where they're like, they'll say a word out loud, right? And they'll say it incorrectly, and they ask students to tell them what the word actually is. So they'll say like shoulder rather than shoulder, and they'll have students like tell them what the right word is, right? And I did that in a program that we developed, and we found that like the program we developed like had okay effects, but I did not think that the effects could be attributed specifically to that activity. And so the data are pretty like unclear whether that actually works. And the study that I'm describing is with kindergarten students, and they got small effects for that, but it was on a very small set of words. And so I'm not convinced that that necessarily is the right thing to do. So let's be clear, teaching students like mispronounced words and having them correct those is a good idea. So because the idea set for variability is that what we talked about, which is like we make the wrong thing the right thing, right? And the set is basically the idea of like, I'm set up mentally for the idea that it's going to be variable, right? So I recognize ahead of time I always found that confusing, like, why is it called this? I still don't love it. I tried to call it something else in a paper one time, but it didn't catch on. So set for variability, it's like, it's not, anyway, so the term set for variability basically means I'm ready for it not to be the correct thing. And so the thing that I think we should do, because I don't think we should teach kids like mispronounced words, is literally to do what we already talked about, which is to teach kids to be flexible so that when they sound something out, they know the correct answer. And it gets to that point of using words deliberately where it might not quite work, right? Not early on, right? So, when you do a word that has like you don't use cotton right at the beginning, maybe, right? Not in the first lesson, but you want to quickly and strategically build in words where it's not perfect, right? Where it does sound a little bit different because we want students to get used to that idea of being flexible. So really, the idea of being flexible is the best way to teach kids set variability. Some of my colleagues at Florida State have talked about, they've been studying how to do that, and they don't have results. I don't know what the results are from those studies. They just finished them last year, but do that, And I think it's also good to remember, phonological awareness is literally, this is why phonological awareness is important, because it's not about sounds in isolation. It's about locating that mental entry in your brain that is, you associate the pronunciation you associate with the written pattern. That's why phonological awareness is so critical. So, even early on when you're teaching kids like phonological awareness and you're segmenting and blending, that's helpful because it gets students to put those sounds together, take them apart so that they understand, when they're putting them together, particularly, they are getting this idea that they come together and they might sound a little off, and then you turn them into the right thing. So if you do, it's fan, not fan, it's not fan, right? But that's really useful to get kids to do that. So that's key.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I know we've heard a few times where people say that sounds like we're just asking kids to guess at what the word is. But what I just heard you say is a word can, or even, a letter or groups of letters can have, a few different ways to pronounce it. So let them be flexible within those. So it's not just take a stab at what you think this word is altogether, but just, be open to trying different sounds out,
right?
That are all sounds that these letters can make.
Yeah, and that's the key part where we get out of guessing, because it's not that we're not telling you, we're telling you it could be the long sound, it could be the short sound, right? So it's not like there's this huge universe of things that it can be, and that alone is really helpful for students. So it's not like kids see EA and we've never taught them that EA says, right? We teach them that EA sometimes says, and then we use that flexibility to get us the rest of the way there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's what we do as adults. That's what we do when we read bigger words. I think if we try to pigeonhole kids into, like, quote the rules, as we said, the rules just, don't always work. And those pattern seeking, our brains are pattern seeking machines. So we want to try to see, like, oh, okay, is there another way to say this that also makes sense, perhaps in other contexts? Kind of freeing,
Yeah.
liberation,
Like your daughter is another great example of that. Like, and what you asked her to do is a really great idea because you asked her to find other examples to sort of like reinforce that idea that like when you see this, it says that, right? Because that's what we're trying to get kids to do is get their brains to pick up on the patterns in the language, right? It's never, it's quasi-regular, but there are things like, notification and, I can't remember the other words that you had or she said, but yep, exactly that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, you mentioned morphology, but I just wanted to circle back to make sure we touched on how important morphology is in reading multisyllabic words. Is there anything else you wanted to say about morphology?
No, the only thing I would add is that you need to give students like a bank of affixes. So, you can't just be like, find the parts, right? You need to tell them what the parts are, right? And I actually watched a lesson recently, like that I was surprised, like they actually did have the kids kind of like figure it out. Like it's like, here are words with ION and like, what do you think it says? I'm not a big fan of like, what do you think it says? I'm a big fan of like TION says shun. What does it say? Shun, right? I do mention a little bit about what it means. Like I'll say like the act of or whatever. It means when you're doing something is the way I usually explain it, right? And so, but I just do that and I focus on TION says shun. Let's read words with TION. So students need a bank of affixes that you teach them ahead of time. So when they go to peel off, they know those. And there's no like perfect bank of them. Just find a decent list of them.
And that can start pretty early in like kindergarten, first grade.
Yes. So yeah, teaching kids like inflections,
ones.
like as, teaching them like inflections meaning like ing, ed, teaching them those things like really early on, great data on that. And then like by end of first grade, second grade, bringing in more of the other affixes. So, third, fourth, fifth grade, they're going to do a lot more with that stuff and they're going to start using them a lot more for meaning and, getting into like bicycle, the bi and the, cycle and so on.
Really quickly, just since we just talked about set for variability or being flexible, you say affixes. In my head, I say affixes. Is it right? Wrong? What's going on?
There's no correct.
No difference? Okay.
No, I mean, listen, if we want to be all like technical about it, it's a short vowel because it's V, CCV, so affixes is possibly correct. But I don't know. Can I also just say, this is my favorite thing. Do you know that basil is not pronounced basil in like the UK?
Just went last summer and they were saying basil and I felt like I was in a movie. It was great.
Yeah. It's a perfect example of this exact thing, right? Where like we did it one way, they did it another way. We basically just divided it in a different like place essentially, right? Do you know what they say for like process in Canada? Like
process.
It's process. So
but we all still understand each other.
Totally.
They do. And we understand them too because it's set for variability because it's so close, right? Yeah. And so, but I just love those examples because it's just like different linguistic kind. We basically chose a different way to divide up the word essentially, right? And so, so I think it's a good example of why flexibility is really important.
Absolutely.
Yes. So fun to think about too. It's, you're like nerdy when you're sitting here like, and what other words are there? Right?
So fun.
All right. So, Devin, I feel like we're coming to a close here, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you'd like to say to a teacher listening who might feel stuck or unsure how to start or like, oh my gosh, this is new information. I've been doing this one way and I want to try to shift or I'm just wanting to learn how to think about it differently. So I'll leave it to you.
Yeah. So I did. So I wrote a couple articles about this that people can email me for. One of them is like totally, I can post it online. I'm working on fixing my website, and I can send it to you all, the two of you too, because you guys can, share things.
Yeah, we can share things publicly. We can put all of this in the show notes if we have the links.
Okay. So. Yeah. So I'll send you the one. So I think you can look at that article to give you some ideas about this because I am pretty specific about some of these things. That's one thing you can do. There are videos online of, people explaining these kinds of things. I've done a couple of them, so you could look for those as an example of what to do. So, if you're not sure, you do want to learn about how these things work, right? And and people asked me recently, like, if you have a program that does this, like, should I just like change it? And my answer was absolutely not. Like, see, if like everybody else in the school is doing that, I think the kids are better off if you don't try to change it. Okay. So like, I don't want to say stay the course exactly if you're using syllable division, but I don't want to say change it tomorrow unless you have that flexibility. And if the kids haven't learned it already, don't change the game on them like, right now. But I think, think about for next year, right? Like, is there a way I could do this differently and consider a different option? If you're doing something with the long words, you're on the right track and focus on morphemes if I was going to say anything specifically.
That's great. So helpful. And yeah, this was so fun to talk with you. You did not disappoint. Thank you for being awesome. This is great. Like we could talk all day, but we're so grateful that you took some time to talk with us and just chat it out about these really important things that teachers are grappling with like every single day. And we're struggling with too. So thank you.
Thank you guys. I mean, you guys do so much great stuff for the field. Like, I think we're all better for the work that you do. So I don't know how many podcasts people say, like, thank you, not just for today, but in general for what you do. But if they do, let me add to that, thank you guys for the work that you do. It's really awesome that you help all of us.
Well, thank you.
Yes.